Hi, everybody. In this lecture, I'll be walking you through chapters 6 through 8 of Texts and Contexts. In this lecture, I'll be using examples drawn from the TV show Stranger Things. So if you've seen it, great. If not, I think you'll still understand the examples because you don't have to have seen the show necessarily to understand them. I'm doing this because it's fresh in my mind because I've recently watched it again, but also because I want to kind of demonstrate to you in these lectures that these types of thinking, these critical perspectives, can really be applied to any cultural artifact. You don't have to just apply them to literature, although we're doing that in this class. So this chapter actually covers quite a bit of content. It covers more than just what we think of as historical criticism proper. It covers several types of contextual criticisms, or critical lenses that place a text in a specific context. And the first context that the chapter covers is a historical and biographical context. So this part of the chapter goes over new historicism, historical criticism, and biographical criticism. The difference between historical criticism and new historical criticism kind of doesn't matter for the purposes of our class. The only difference between those two types of criticism, or those two critical lenses or perspectives, is that the view of history is different. And again, for the purposes of our class, that's kind of splitting hairs and it doesn't really matter. So read that section, enjoy it, but really just know that historical criticism simply just places a text in a historical context. And biographical criticism similarly places a text in a biographical context. Often these are done together because it's hard to separate an author from his or her time period, or a producer of content, I suppose, if we're talking about, film or something, from the time and place that the person existed in. So an example of historical and biographical criticism applied to the TV show Stranger Things might look something like this. You can think of these examples as possible thesis statements for an essay. You won't actually be writing an essay about Stranger Things in the class, sadly, but if you were, a thesis statement for an essay, the main point an essay might make, looking at Stranger Things from a historical and biographical perspective, might look something like this. So here's the example. Although it's set primarily in 1980s Indiana, the representation of Vecna in Stranger Things contains parallels to the modern internet. And so this really is covering where the show is taking place, and also when the show is taking place, but more importantly, how the influence of the time period when the show was written plays out in the show. Was that the most confusing sentence ever? Did that make sense? My point is, the TV show Stranger Things, or the Netflix show, I guess, Stranger Things, is set in the 1980s, but it was written, recently, in the last, 5-10 years, depending on when you're watching this. So anyway, it was written recently, and it was written during a time when the internet existed, although it's set in a time when I don't believe it did. I didn't know about it probably until the late 90s, although I'm sure it existed before then. I'm babbling. Anyway, this is an example of historical and biographical criticism in that it demonstrates how the time period when something was written shows up in that thing. Okay, does that make sense? Next page. Here is the rest of the stuff, technical term there, that's in chapter 6. So cultural studies. This type of critical perspective places a text in a cultural context. That just means what it says. So the culture that it was produced in shows up in some interesting ways, perhaps, in it. And so here's an example of that type of critical perspective applied to this show. So in highlighting friendship as the most important feature of adolescent development, Stranger Things has been influenced by the coming-of-age stories of the 80s, such as Goonies, Explorers, and Stand By Me. And so in a particular culture in the 1980s, in, American middle-class culture, I guess, in the 1980s, Goonies, Explorers, and Stand By Me were kind of the go-to. Maybe a lot of you haven't seen those, but I watched them 100 bajillion times as a kid. And you can kind of see the influence of that in the writing of Stranger Things. Marxist criticism is a type of critical perspective that places a text in the context of social class and political and economic systems. I mean, it's called Marxist criticism in that Karl Marx wrote about social class and political and economics systems. I got a little tongue-tied there. But you don't necessarily have to be like versed in the writings of Karl Marx or whatever to do this type of criticism. All you really have to do is consider what a text might say about social class, political systems, economic systems. How do those types of factors show up in a text? An example of this is, in Stranger Things, adolescents who are economically and socially vulnerable also frequently prove to be the most vulnerable to the otherworldly forces in Hawkins, Indiana. I haven't thought about that long enough and really applied it to the show thoroughly enough to know whether that's exclusively true. I don't think it is, but anyway, would it be supportable is another issue, I guess. It is a good example of Marxist criticism in that it's about social class and economics. So, onward. Political criticism places a text in the context of colonial forces and what am I talking about? Post-colonial criticism. I read that wrong. Political criticism is several slides in the future for us. Post-colonial criticism places a text in the context of colonial forces, meaning one nation kind of taking over another nation, perhaps, and power relationships that they produce. So you can think of like one country as being a colonizer, the other country that it takes over as being the colonized, and then all kinds of relationships between people, groups of people, nations themselves, groups of nations kind of come about as a result of that. And post-colonial criticism is really maybe one of the only types of criticism that lends itself best to certain types of texts. And those types of texts are ones in which we can see relationships between colonizing forces and forces that are colonized, or populations that are colonized. This is easier to see with an example. I mean, the book goes over it in more detail, but an example here is that you can see a colonizer-colonized relationship between Dr. Martin Brenner, or Papa, and Eleven, and that might be interesting to examine in a post-colonial analysis of Stranger Things. So the colonizer-colonized relationship between Dr. Martin Brenner and Eleven in Stranger Things represents the dangers of unintended consequences arising from such relationships. So you can see Martin Brenner kind of using Eleven for his own purposes and developing her into this almost like weapon to be able to spy. And well, maybe I shouldn't give too many spoilers in case you haven't seen the show, but anyway, she has these powers, and she has them because he's kind of, in one interpretation at least, colonized her. He's colonized her mind in a way and kind of given her these powers, but not given her them by choice. So she's kind of under his control. And then all kinds of other stuff, which I won't tell you about in case you haven't seen the show and are still planning to watch it, ensues as a result of that. Some of it not so good. Psychological criticism. Chapter 7 covers psychological criticism. And this perspective will be interesting to you if you are at all interested in psychology, if you've taken, Psych 200 or other psych classes here at GHC or at other institutions. You can use any ideas you've learned in those psychology classes or in psychology texts that you've read and apply them to works we're reading in this class to produce interesting psychological interpretations. Because really all this critical perspective does is it uses various psychological theories as interpretive lenses for literary works. So you might look at like the writings of Sigmund Freud and apply them to a work of literature. This happens all the time. So this type of criticism can focus on a character in a work or multiple characters. You can try to like psychoanalyze a character and figure out what their motivations and desires and fears might be, that they're not speaking necessarily, but that you can glean from their actions and words. You could apply this type of criticism to the speaker or narrator of a literary work, so the speaking voice in a poem or the narrative voice in a short story or novel or something, or the author, him or herself. Remember, we don't want to conflate the speaker and narrator and the author. The speaker, the narrator, those are fictional constructs, sometimes that look a lot like the author, but we can't assume that an author necessarily is writing about him or herself, because a lot of the time authors don't do that. So anyway, You can psychoanalyze a character, the speaker, the narrator, the author. An example of this, again, from this show, Stranger Things, could be that Vecna represents the destructive power of past trauma. So, how do I say this without giving too much away? If you haven't seen the show, I guess you could fast forward a little bit if you don't want to know too much. But what I mean there is that often the characters in the story, the characters on the show who kind of fall prey to Vecna, or who he, I guess, preys upon, are characters who have past trauma, past traumatic experiences. And so you could almost see this as being representative of how our past traumas come back to haunt us or might negatively impact our everyday lives. Okay, the last chapter in this group of chapters we're focusing on today is chapter 8. And this chapter covers all types of criticism, well, not all, some of the most famous, some of the most important, I guess, types of criticism that focus on gender and sexuality. So feminist criticism, queer theory. I think that the chapter also kind of explains some minute differences between feminist criticism and post-feminist criticism. I don't really care about that for the purposes of our class. You might find it interesting, but essentially what you need to know for our class and what we're doing in it is that these types of criticism, feminist criticism and queer theory, they all focus on how gender identity, sexual orientation, and power are represented in literature, and whether they promote stereotypes or undermine them. So this might interest you if you kind of think about these types of things, which a lot of us do. The book calls these types of criticism political. I started to jump ahead 1 or 2 slides back, called post-colonial criticism, political criticism, which it's not. But these types of criticism, feminist and queer theory, they're not really political in the sense of like the left and the right, or Democrats and Republicans. I've had students start to read this chapter and kind of freak out and email me and say like, I don't want to read about political fights. And that's not what this type of criticism is about at all. Instead, the word political here is being used to mean groups of people and the interests that they might represent or the interests that they might have. So an example of a group of people would be, for instance, women. And so feminist criticism in a way is political in that it focuses on, women and their interests, I guess. Not interests like they're interested in something, but interests like we stand for this and we want this and whatever. We don't all have to stand as a group, but again, I'm starting to babble because this is interesting to me. So an example of a thesis statement or an interpretation, I guess, from the perspective of feminist criticism would be, Stranger Things appears to undermine gender stereotypes. Gender stereotypes, do you know what I mean when I say that? So some kind of a generalization about a group of people that's kind of hasty and that doesn't really fit everybody. Like, all girls like playing with Barbies or something. That's sort of a stereotype. Like, sure, some girls do, but a lot of them don't, and a lot of boys do too, and whatever. So it's a stereotype. Stranger Things appears to undermine gender stereotypes in that it has a strong female character, 11, but one could argue that it actually promotes the age-old view that women have mysterious, unseen powers that nobody can ever truly understand. This is kind of like a common cultural narrative that we hear all the time. Like, nobody could possibly understand the mind of a woman. Women have secret intuition. They understand what other people are thinking. They're mind readers. But I never understand what they're thinking. You've probably heard things like this before, or maybe you've even felt this way before, and this is something we hear all the time. At least it's something I hear all the time. And so, in a way, you could kind of see this show, although I love the show, I'm not trying to argue it's sexist or something, but I love the show, but you could kind of see how maybe that aspect of it might be, instead of undermining stereotypes about women, maybe promoting them. I don't know, it's up to you. And the interesting thing about these interpretations is that they're not really interpretations that are useful or interesting if nobody could potentially disagree with them. So if you think, that's absolutely not true, that's fine. Because to be honest, I don't even know if I believe that, but I was trying to think of an example. So anyway, that is chapters 6 through 8. And as always, if you have questions about any of the material in this lecture or anything that we're doing in class, please send me an email. Stop by my office hours. I'd love to talk to you.